Welcome to This Explainer. We're jumping straight into a truly fascinating intersection today. We're looking at the exact point where cold, calculated economic theory crashes headfirst into the incredibly messy, completely unpredictable reality of family dynamics. We're going to unpack some fascinating research by Sergio da Silva that reevaluates a classic economic concept by injecting real flawed human psychology into the mix. Let's dive right in.
To get us started, think about this deeply paradoxical question for a second. Can a purely selfish person, someone who literally only looks out for their own interests, accidentally make everyone in their family happier and wealthier? It sounds totally impossible, right? But for decades, traditional economics argued that the answer was a resounding yes. Section 1. The Rotten Kid Theorem. Okay, so this wild, highly counterintuitive idea actually goes way back to 1974. It's called the Rotten Kid Theorem, coined by the influential economist Gary Becker. The strict logic works kind of like this. Imagine you have a family with a benevolent, altruistic head of the household who pools all the family's resources and shares them out. Now introduce a rotten kid, a completely selfish family member. Becker's theorem states that this rotten kid will actually behave in ways that maximize the family's total income. Why? Well, because if they shrink the overall family pie, the altruistic head has less to distribute, which means the rotten kid's own slice shrinks too. It's pure, calculated self-interest acting as a bizarre form of teamwork.
Section 2. The Nightlight Dilemma.
To really grasp how this theorem works, let's look at Becker's classic hypothetical scenario. This example puts this abstract theory right into the marital bedroom. Let's contrast the two spouses here to highlight the core friction. On one side, we have an altruistic husband. He loves reading at night with a nightlight. But because he loves his wife, he already cuts back his reading time to try and accommodate her. He also regularly gives her gifts out of the family pool. On the other side, we have the selfish wife. She hates the nightlight, she literally just wants to sleep, but she absolutely loves receiving those gifts from her husband. Now imagine one day an electrician offers the wife a chance to secretly and permanently disconnect that night.
According to the Rotten Kid Theorem, what's her rational choice? She leaves the light on. In a perfectly logical economic world, the selfish wife calculates that disconnecting the light lowers her husband's overall happiness, which means he's going to give her fewer gifts. She realizes the loss of gifts is actually worse than the loss of sleep. Therefore, keeping the light on is what economists call a Pareto optimal outcome. That's really just a fancy way of saying it's the best possible compromise that keeps her personal benefits and the family's overall well-being as high as possible. So, pure logic wins.
Section 3. Enter cognitive biases.
But let's be real for a second. Human psychology completely shatters that perfect mathematical logic. Spouses at 2 a.m. do not operate like living calculators. Da Silva's research introduces behavioral economics into the mix, looking at a whole multitude of cognitive biases. We're talking about things like the endowment effect, overconfidence bias, hyperbolic discounting, projection bias, status quo bias, optimism bias, the gambler's fallacy, and anchoring bias. This massive list illustrates the sheer number of ways real people systematically deviate from strict economic rationality.
Let's connect these biases directly to the wife's choice. What if she suffers from hyperbolic discounting? That basically means she heavily favors an immediate reward, like a good night's sleep tonight, way over some future reward, like a gift next week. Or what if she has an overconfidence bias? She might simply believe she can secretly pull the plug on the nightlight and her husband won't ever actually stop buying her gifts. Suddenly, pulling the plug doesn't seem irrational to her at all. It feels like the absolutely right move, even if it ends up damaging the family's overall welfare.
Section 4. An AI family simulation.
So to test if the theorem actually holds up to human irrationality, the researchers designed an in silico experiment. That just means they ran it entirely through a computer simulation. Let's break down this hybrid methodology step by step so we understand exactly how this digital family was put to the test. First, they didn't just guess how strong these biases are. They tasked ChatGPT-4 to scan vast amounts of published psychological and behavioral economics literature to calibrate the realistic strength of each bias. Second, they built a complex Python script mathematically representing the marriage, the utility of sleep, and the husband's contributions. Finally, they simulated 1,000 nights of decision-making to see how a biased wife and an altruistic husband would actually fare over time.
As you can see, the AI scanned existing psychological research to set the baseline parameters for our selfish wife. For instance, it calibrated overconfidence as a moderate bias in the code. This reflects real-world behavioral trends, where people generally tend to be somewhat overconfident in their abilities to control outcomes.
But it definitely didn't stop at just one trait. Status quo bias was also factored into the code as a moderate strength parameter. The simulation wasn't just testing a single human flaw. It tested an environment where multiple biases, like overconfidence, a demand for immediate comfort, and a resistance to change, were all operating at the exact same time, just like in a real human brain.
Section 5. The messy reality.
So, the moment of truth. What happens to the family's economic output when 1,000 nights of these biased, flawed decisions play out? Does the rotten kid theorem survive? The answer is a definitive no. In a purely rational world, under the theorem, the husband's optimal contribution to the family would maintain a perfect baseline of 1.0. But in the simulation, driven by the wife's psychologically biased decisions to disconnect the light, the husband's average contribution dropped down to 0.92. The data proves that once you introduce human psychology, the rotten kid actually does hurt the family output. The self-correcting magic of the theorem just completely breaks down.
And looking closer, the data reveals a striking bimodal split in the husband's contributions. Basically, there are two extreme outcomes happening. While there are times things stay stable, there is a massive spike on the low end of the spectrum, over on the left. That represents the frequent, undeniable times his contributions absolutely tanked, specifically because of her irrational choices to pull the plug.
Now, what about their overall happiness or utility? The wife's average utility was 1.16, and the husband's was 1.49. On the surface, it seems they survived the 1,000 nights, but averages lie. The underlying data showed the ranges were wildly unpredictable. The wife's utility swung anywhere from a miserable 0.04 to a highly satisfied 2.55. This massive spread tells a chaotic story of a relationship constantly fluctuating in satisfaction.
Take a look at the spread of the wife's utility. It is completely chaotic, just scattered all over the map. This really drives home the fact that cognitive biases create an unpredictable, messy reality. Traditional economics assumes a smooth, optimal curve where everyone perfectly negotiates their best interests. But as the data shows, real life is anything but smooth.
Section 6. Economics meets human nature.
This quote from Sergio da Silva really hits the nail on the head and perfectly encapsulates our key takeaway. The simulations show that the husband's contributions decrease, indicating that selfish individuals may not always act to increase the overall family welfare when cognitive biases are present. The rotten kid theorem is a mathematical and logical masterpiece on paper, for sure, but it fails in the real world because it fundamentally ignores the beautiful, irrational complexity of human psychology. People are driven by impulses, immediate desires, and overconfidence, not just a shared bank account.
Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. If even our most intimate relationships, our families, don't operate on pure logic and are constantly disrupted by cognitive biases, just how much of our broader economic world, our markets, our policies, our everyday transactions, is actually driven by the exact same human irrationality? It really makes you rethink every decision you make, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning the logic of the world around you.